So welcome to the first TSDA webinar. I'm Niki Newton, the Senior Biodiversity Evidence Specialist at JNCC. We're hoping that this webinar is going to be a really useful opportunity for you to discover some of the work we've been doing, and would love to hear whether there are areas in your work where you think the findings that we present here might be helpful. This is the first webinar we've run of this nature, and it's a bit of an experiment, so bear with us as we try and navigate the wonders of Skype for Business webinar functioning. We hope it will be really useful and engaging though. We will be recording this initially for our records, but if we can censor it appropriately such that it's fit for sharing under GDPR rules, then we will do, and we've shared the slides around with you, so hopefully you've got those anyway. We're going to be running it as a sort of partially interactive presentation for up to an hour, and then we're going to have about half an hour of discussions, which hopefully will be really useful, and it will work best if you're happy to engage in the discussions and contribute your views as we go along. We'll be using the conversation function in Skype for Business for questions, so if you think of any during the presentation, please feel free to send them through, and we'll address them either at the end or an appropriate point during if they're really urgent. So we're asking for any questions that you've got about the work or any comments that you've got in response to the questions we ask, which will be periodic throughout. So the conversation function, in case you haven't found it, is in the bottom left-hand corner of your screens. It's a little speech bubble. Yes. Who are TSDA? Hopefully some of you have heard of us before. We are the Terrestrial Surveillance Development and Analysis Partnership, comprised of the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, JNCC, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, CEH, and the British Trust for Ornithology, CTO. Together we fund and undertake various projects under this TSDA partnership. There's quite a large number of staff involved, including quite a few on the line today, and the staff involved in the work we're discussing here are on the screen. So it's Rob and Philipp from BTO, me from JNCC, and Michael from CEH. So projects undertaken by TSDA have two main themes. Firstly, there is development work for a variety of UK biodiversity recording schemes. So JNCC support a number of schemes in which volunteers record a wide variety of taxa, including birds, bats, butterflies, plants, and a range of other invertebrates and mammals, through support of the Biological Records Centre. So here we're referring to these two types of data as falling into structured and unstructured categories, and we'll discuss more about what this means later. All the organisations involved with running and funding and steering the recording schemes are a member of the UK Terrestrial Evidence Partnership of Partnerships, which collaborates to share developments and best practice between terrestrial biodiversity monitoring initiatives. And TSDA undertakes work that will benefit the development of multiple TPOP schemes. So the other aspect of TSDA work is analytical work, which works across the recording schemes that I've mentioned. Work in this area includes predictive modelling and development of new metrics using the species data which is collected from the TPOP schemes. The work undertaken by TSDA is aligned with JNCC's new Terrestrial Biodiversity Evidence Strategy, which has just been published, and it's been developed with the TPOP partners. So throughout the development of this strategy, it was really evident that there was a lot of support for the data collection that the schemes and societies do. So how have we decided to target our work effort in TSDA? We want outputs to be really useful to TPOP partners. So we undertook a needs assessment in 2018, which involved sending a questionnaire to environmental public bodies, including country agencies, DEFRA, devolved administrations, the Environment Agency, SEPA, Forestry Commission, and EPA. This pulled out a number of key themes as important for these organisations, where biodiversity data was important and required for statutory reporting, unsurprisingly, operational needs such as provision of local advice, monitoring interventions like looking at the impacts of agri-environment schemes or conservation efforts. Then there was also quite a lot of interest in slightly more conceptual ideas like measuring ecosystem health and resilience, and this fed into strategic planning, which was moving generally a bit more towards looking at ecosystems and their health rather than maybe more single species approach that may have been used in the past. And that was sort of trickling through into more policy making. It was generally identified that existing surveillance does meet people's needs, but that coverage could be a bit better. Although there is a bit of an issue here in that the more evidence you provide to people, it almost creates new gaps. So if you provide people with a trend for the UK, it means that then trends for countries becomes desirable. And if people have a trend for a country, they might want trends for a region. So there can always be more gaps that we can fill, essentially. But the general feeling was that the agencies would use the outputs available, but use them in a risk-based way. So they'd balance the statistical power against alignment with their policies and drivers. There were some key areas of need that were highlighted to us, such as a desire for more information on ecosystem health, but in some cases it wasn't particularly specifically articulated what this would require for better evidence provision. But if you have any thoughts about that, we'd love to hear them in the conversation function, and we can discuss them later on. But generally, TSDA helps us to explore the balance between what the agencies, science and volunteers want from biodiversity evidence. So, yes, sorry, I should have been saying the slides that we were up to. We're now on slide 5 for everybody following, which has some green boxes on about structured data. So I've been talking about structured and unstructured data earlier on, and what do we mean by that? So structured data, for the context of this presentation, is data that's collected where a sampling protocol has been employed in collecting it. So that covers many of the schemes that are run by various partnerships, including, for example, the UK BMS, the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, the Breeding Bird Survey. And there are different ways that, or different sampling processes that these schemes can use. So some schemes collect data based on randomly stratified site selection, and some sites specifically monitor sites of interest. But generally they have in common that they are revisited at set frequencies and with standardized effort put into collecting data. At the other end of the scale, there's more unstructured data, which is collected through more heterogeneous methods and is more sort of ad hoc created. So it's more like the sort of record that your hoverfly enthusiast might put onto iRecord, which would all be compiled together within the schemes and societies, which are supported by BRC. And there are over 80 of these. So they generally have a more varied level of effort into data collection that is not necessarily known. In the middle of that, you've got sort of semi-structured data, which will be discussed a bit more later. And if you analyse unstructured and structured data together, you can do analyses with integrated data, which we'll also be looking at a bit more. So what are we going to be talking about today? Rob is going to be talking about some of the findings from the assessment of coverage work that's been recently completed within TSDA, and he'll focus on the structured data. And then following this, Michael will discuss the unstructured data and our ability to derive trends from these sources. So the webinar's then going to look at the preliminary results for some analysis where we've been looking at integrating unstructured and structured data that Philipp and Michael will both talk about. And then finally, we'd really like some engagement with you as data users as to what would be most helpful for the TSDA partnership to do next in this area, and present some of the ideas that we're looking at developing. So next slide. Throughout the presentation, we've got some kind of targeted questions, which we'd really like to hear your views on in the conversation section. And we're also going to try out, excitingly, the poll function on Skype for Business. So the first question that we want to ask you, just to sort of get a feel for who is on the line, is how much do you use TPOC species data in your work? So this could be as a raw or interpreted form, and it can be either structured or unstructured. So hopefully you can all see a poll on the screen, and it would be really great to see your responses. I'm now going to pass on, after giving you a little bit of time to do the poll, to Rob Robinson from BTO, who's going to be talking more about the coverage assessment. Oh, we're getting results flooding in. This is very exciting. Okay. Okay. Oh no, they are still coming in. We'll give you another 10 seconds. Great. So it looks like there's quite a few people, about 40% of people on the line that use data really frequently, but quite a lot of people that could see some more uses for it. So that's really, really good to know who's on the line. So we'll go over to Rob now.
Yeah, okay, thank you. Hello, everybody. Thank you all for coming. It's really great to be able to share our work in this way. And I want to sort of talk initially just about some of the work that we did looking at the coverage of the schemes that sort of Niki very briefly outlined, and focus on the sort of the more structured end of the spectrum. And whilst we were thinking about this, we realized that there were actually three questions that we need to that we use these data to address. Niki, can you press the next button? Hopefully the first one will appear on the screen. Excellent. So the first thing is simply where do things occur and how is this changing? What is the distribution of the species? And of course we can get at this through either sort of structured sampling or through some of the more ad hoc records that people submit through things like our record. Next. And then at a slightly more detailed level, we want to know how many things there are, and again, how that is changing. And typically that requires some sort of sampling protocol so that you can account for variation in effort. And finally, next. And then once we know how many things are and why they're changing, then we obviously want to know why they're changing. And this obviously requires more intensive work, some of which we can do through TPOP, through the sort of the demographic schemes for birds particularly, but other mechanisms for doing this might be through sort of bespoke research programs that look at individual species. And obviously this is quite intensive stuff, but I think if we want to do effective conservation, often we need to understand these mechanisms. Next. So the first thing that we did was simply to look at the relative coverage of the different taxonomic groups. And this was some work that was led by Stuart at BTO, with input from many people, both here and at CH and elsewhere. And what Stuart did was he took those three questions and he asked in a qualitative way how much or how good are the data do we have for each of these three different sets of questions. And then he combined the scores to give an overall score for the taxonomic group. And if you want to see a bit more about how that was done and a bit more about how the constituent scores pan out for the different groups, then I'd urge you to look at the report. And I suspect most of this won't come as a surprise to many of you, but for groups like birds, plants, and invertebrates, we probably have relatively good data for species. For things like fungi and slime molds, obviously we have relatively poor coverage. But I think it's sort of it's quite helpful to see the sort of the relative balance across the groups here. And I think we have to acknowledge that it's always going to be a challenge. We are never going to have detailed recording of slime molds, I suspect, but somebody can prove me wrong. And we are going to need a combination of data sources to really start to address some of these three three questions that we highlighted. And I guess that's really what the arc of this work is to try and see if we can improve things. The slides are going quite fast. Are you pressing them, Niki? Or are they happening automatically? Oh, it's gone back. Okay. And then Niki obviously at the beginning highlighted this sort of knowledge gap conundrum. So the gaps that we consider for birds, where we want to know about sort of regional changes, perhaps in particular species, are questions we wouldn't even consider for things like fungi. Once you have more data, then inevitably there's one asks for more detail, which is something that we just need to bear in mind as we think about the sort of the different coverage and the different questions that we can ask and want to ask for the different taxonomic groups. So next. So we obviously have some structured schemes. They do require significant sort of a volunteer time investment because they've got to get to grips with the methodology, and they've usually got to go out into the field at particular times, so they have to sort of alter their daily routine, if you like. So they do require a bit of time investment. And one of the things that we wanted to know is how good is their coverage. And to do this, we looked at the sort of the four key schemes that run as part of the Teapot Partnership: the Breeding Bird Survey, the National Bat Monitoring Programme, the Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, and the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. And again, this was work that was done by Jenny Taylor here at BTO. What we did here was we said that looked for species where we had more than 30 squares in a particular region, and yeah, so we assumed that if you had more than 30 squares in a particular region, you could generate a reasonably robust trend. And I think you can see the pattern by the sort of the government office regions there on the right, and they're broadly the patterns are similar across schemes. And I suspect if you've been involved in running schemes, the patterns won't come as much of a surprise. We generally do better for birds and butterflies. We generally do better in the south and the east of Britain, although this isn't entirely down to sort of volunteer density, if you like, because coverage is relatively poor in London. So there are perhaps opportunities to thinking about engagements here. One of the things I should point out is that the plants come out relatively poorly, but that's largely because the National Plant Monitoring Scheme wasn't designed for this purpose. We're sort of rather repurposing it to look at species trends rather than habitat quality, which was its original aim. But even here, we're not getting full coverage, so there are things to work on there. And one of the things the report looks at is sort of recommendations for ways that we might fill some of these gaps. Again, if you want to look at the details of that, I don't think that we'll go through them here, but I would encourage you to have a look at the report. Next slide. So this is just a slightly different way of looking at that for sort of three of the groups. And what we said is if you are in a 1 kilometre square in any part of the country, how far would you have to go to achieve this sort of notional coverage of 30 samples? And here the darker colours indicate a sort of a greater radius, so you need to go further to get your 30 samples. So we can we can't look in as fine a resolution in those areas. So you can see in sort of the southeast and the Midlands, we can do you can see generally lighter colours, so we can sort of monitor species potentially in finer detail with the structured data. By the time you get into some of the sort of the northern and the western areas, then obviously the scale of which we are looking at things has to increase. Next slide. So the other thing that we looked at was habitat, and we looked at some broad habitat categories here. The asterisk at the top of the slide is to remind me that we did this by looking at the habitats of the transect sections that were covered, rather than looking at species. So this is species in particular habitats, and it sort of, perhaps not unsurprisingly, broadly follows the regional coverage. We can say something about birds and butterflies in most habitats. Some of the bats and the plants are sort of a little bit less well covered, and things like broadleaf woodland, you get relatively good coverage, but sort of upland habitats, you get relatively poor coverage. Again, for many of you, this probably won't come as a surprise, but it's sort of nice to see it in a sort of black and white, if you like. Next slide. So just while I've been talking, I'm sure you've come up with thoughts about where what gaps are sort of most important to you, perhaps in your work or in what you think our understanding of the species is. So if you could, we'd be interested to get your thoughts on what you think the most critical gap in species coverage is from your point of view. So if you wanted to add some comments using the chat function, that would be really great. And then if you have a sentence or so as to why that is, that would be even more helpful. So next slide. So whilst you're thinking about that and doing that, we'll hand over to Michael, who looked in some detail at the unstructured data.
Okay, thank you very much, Rob. So, as Niki introduced at the beginning, we've got these broadly two different types of data. Rob's gone through a lot of the structured data in terms of thinking about the sorts of schemes that we've been looking at, but you can also see how taxonomically restricted they are. So maybe that doesn't meet some of the needs that people within the needs assessment expressed in terms of getting a more comprehensive coverage of ecosystem health. And I use that term in quotes. The sorts of work that Rob just talked about often use this rule of thumb of about 30 sites needed for decent analysis to get species trends. And this is particularly the thing that we're looking at, changes in species status over time. And in his case, it was particularly for abundance. So we've got that rule of thumb. If you could go on, Niki. The issue with the unstructured data is that we do have huge amounts of data available, but until fairly recently, we didn't know what the rule of thumb was. We didn't know how many records were suitable in order to do some of the modelling. So we had these big pots of data, these unstructured data for a vast number of different species, but we didn't know when it might be suitable. If you can go on. So most of this unstructured data comes from the schemes, the recording schemes supported by the Biological Records Centre. So of course these will be verified data which go through a process of verification by typically volunteer recorders. You can see in the top left that this covers a really wide variety of taxonomic groups. It's always brilliant to present this sort of thing internationally and see people's eyes widen when they discover that we've got flea recording schemes and all the rest of it, and a range of different lesser or more obscure invertebrate groups. Even and there are large amounts of data which come through these different recording schemes. So iRecord is one way in which we're able to collate data and push these out to the schemes, and we're getting over 1 million records. You can see even from that little map there that the coverage is good, is actually amazingly good, but it still is patchy and there are gaps within that coverage. So how do we go on to use these data? And so next, Niki. So the use of the unstructured data is we will typically take, or one of the ways in which we can use it is we will take lists of sightings, and we can use those as presence absence by inferring non-detections, or at least non-reports. From these sorts of data, we can estimate detectability. So particularly the sorts of sites which have been visited a few times allows us to estimate the probability that a person will record that particular species. And that can be done in more simple or much more complicated ways. And once we know about the detectability of the species, we can estimate occupancy. And so then we can get occupancy estimated annually, in the case of the graph here, and see how that's changing over time. There are a range of different complicated ways that at CEH and at various other places with collaboration we've been developing this. And I'm sure you're familiar with this because these sorts of data have gone into things like the State of Nature report. And so we can see how a vast number, an incredible number of species are doing. In this case, or in the last State of Nature report, it was over 6,000 species we were able to report on their changes in occupancy. And so that's great. But as we're beginning to think about maybe some of the gaps and the needs, and particularly thinking about taking it down in terms of spatial resolution, and as Rob showed, talking about the different areas or regions within the UK, how far can we take these data? How far can we push them? So that led us on to thinking about these rules of thumb for unstructured data, because what we don't want to do is run these models for every single possible scenario and work out how many of them fall over or work well. So next, please. What we did was, you can see there examples of two trends, one of which on the left is clearly not very informative. The 95% confidence limits are huge, going nearly up to 1, whereas the one on the right seems much more informative. And so what we did was we went through a process of asking experts to say, what types of trends do you think are informative, and or what confidence limits are important? So next. So we were able to divide these broadly into those which fell below the threshold and those which fell above the threshold. And you can see then the distribution of the 10,000 or so trends that we used for this particular analysis. And you can see their spread of distributions. So those in blue are above the threshold. So then what we did was we actually dug into the data sets a little bit more. We looked to describe the data sets briefly, to look at these sorts of precision of the outputs, to look at these sorts of precision of the outputs, in order to predict the precision of the outputs. We did a range of complicated stats, which is included in this bioarchive preprint that is freely available to anyone to look at. And to summarize or simplify a lot of the complexity there, what it seemed to be is that if you wanted to have an occupancy trend analysis that fell with precision that fell above the threshold, then we typically needed 30 records per species per year from these multi-species recording schemes data sets. Actually, if the species are rare, then we can get away with fewer data, and the reason for that is that we've got a lot of non-detection data, non-detection data, which helps inform the production of the trends. So it's complete chance that 30 is the same as the 30 sites that Rob talked about earlier. And in fact, if we go on, we're able to see that although that can be a rule of thumb, in order for us to be able to distinguish between when we might be able to do something with the data and when we can't, you can see from the graph there that that line shows that the more records you get per year, the greater the level of precision anyway. So clearly, maybe this is not a surprise to you, but in general, the more data, the better. There clearly are some species which seem to be really quite precise, even with few records per year, and it would be interesting to dig into that a little bit more. But overall, what we've now done is we've been able to have an evidence-based way to be able to get these rules of thumb. When do we have enough records for occupancy modelling? Now, it is really important to say that that rule of thumb doesn't say that once we meet that threshold, if you like, it doesn't mean that the trends we get are accurate. It doesn't mean that they're representative. It clearly will require a bit of further work in order to investigate these further. But what it does do is it gives us that indication as to where, when we don't have data sets that meet that threshold, they clearly won't be suitable for the modelling. So this is valuable, and I'll show you how we took that on in just a moment. But one of the other things to mention that we realised was really important as we were doing this analysis is that actually the most informative visits are revisits to sites, and particularly the revisits to sites which were only visited once in the past. This then is a really practical thing that we can work with volunteers within these recording schemes to encourage, and it's something that we're going to be testing through the TSDA project in this coming summer with a couple of example schemes. So we're basically going to be doing an experiment and seeing how willing people are to be nudged. How much of an incentive is it for people when they're doing recording to go to the sorts of sites where they know that their records will be especially valuable because they really add information into our occupancy analysis. So it'd be really interesting to see the results of that, and we will of course keep you informed. So if we go on, I said that we've got this rule of thumb of 30 records per species per year to be above the precision threshold. So the great thing about that now is that we can use this to rapidly query existing data sets and just assess how feasible might it be to do occupancy trend analysis. I'll keep emphasising this doesn't prove that the results we would get from such analysis are accurate or truly representative. So that would require further work, but it's a good first cut. In fact, there's an example here from the ERAMP project where some colleagues of mine did this by looking at the data that's available in Wales and used these rules of thumb as a quick pass in order to see what potential there was for that to for species reporting to occur. So if we go on, what we did within the TSDA project, and this is detailed in that bioarchive paper and also within our coverage report, is we looked across a range of different species or species groups, and in this case first of all within all of Great Britain. And what we did was we said how many species or what proportion of species within those groups have we got data for that is above that threshold, that 30 sites per year. So the way to interpret this, and it's ranked from the best to the least good from left to right, is the boxes that have more blue in them have a greater number of or greater proportion of species that are likely to meet this precision threshold and therefore likely to be modelable. So you can see that actually we can do reasonably well for quite a wide variety of species, including some of the less charismatic groups, if I may call that, which is clearly valuable at the Great Britain level in terms of thinking about reporting on ecosystem health. But then what we did, if we go on, is we looked at this within different regions. This is where there's a huge amount of information. Some of you may have seen preliminary versions of this in the past. So the key things that we can identify here is that there are some taxa which clearly it looks like we will be able to do occupancy analysis using these unstructured data for quite a range of species within, for example, butterflies, dragonflies, moths. Those seem to be quite well covered across the different regions. It's clearly better in southeast of England and the east of England. We tend to do better for more species in those regions. It's just as Rob found, it's not entirely affected by population density, human population density, because we can see that relatively populous regions like London and even the north of England or parts of the north of England seem to be much more poorly covered. So there might be particular areas where we could emphasise or promote and support unstructured recording. So the benefit of doing it in this way is that we can begin to see where the opportunities are, where the needs might be, and we can begin to highlight and prioritise. So it'd be really interesting to get your perspectives on your take-homes from this. Where are the opportunities, and where might the greatest needs be for us to be able to develop the use of unstructured data in reporting of species trends. Now, if we go on, thinking about recorders and this unstructured recording, one of the things that is obvious when you think about it, or certainly if you meet recorders and go out recording with people, is that there are many different types of recorder who will be contributing to these sorts of data sets. You might get the enthusiasts who do incredible jobs at recording widely of their taxa of particular interest. You might get patch watchers who just love recording regularly in particular locations. Twitchers, those people who go hunting all over the country for interesting things. And casual recorders, the sorts of people maybe like you or me with busy jobs, and just occasionally we manage to get out and make a few reports which go into this thing and add to our knowledge and information. So there's all these sorts of people, and clearly things like apps have really supported the change in this and making casual records even more likely to come in. So one of the things that we were concerned about then was we were thinking, well, does this change in the type of recorders contributing data, does that have an impact on our ability to use those unstructured data? And if we go on, the positive message, and this is work that's still in progress just at the moment, is the initial results suggest that actually the trend estimates we get out from these by sampling the data sets according to the different types of recorders are actually fairly robust. And that's a really positive message. So the fact that we're getting many more, or appear to be getting many more casual recorders, just type in your observation via an app and press send, that won't seem to affect or bias our overall trend estimates. What we do find is that with certain types of recorder, there do appear to be some variation in basically the height of that line on the graph. So the occupancy, the proportion of sites that are occupied, will vary a bit, which is to do with the sampling biases of the sites which are visited. And precision can also be affected a little bit as well. And these are initial results, and they require a bit of further work, but initial results look really quite positive. So this is one of the benefits of the TSDA, that we've been able to show that yes, when we can get these trends from these types of data, then that will be something which is robust and then available for people within agencies, NGOs and so on, that will be available for them to use. So thinking about then the future of TSDA within this particular bit of work, so moving on to the next slide. What we did, and as Rob and I and others thought about within this report, was we were thinking about the opportunities. Where can we make better use of, how can we support the data that we're getting? How can we get better data and make better use of it? So there are a few different things here, and those which have got the TSDA at the end are indicators of the sorts of work that we're particularly prioritizing over the next couple of years. So that includes work that we've been doing currently actually already on acoustic sampling, and the opportunities for that for recording species, but also for recording soundscapes and things like this. Now, we've sort of presented earlier, we presented this clear difference between structured and unstructured data. One of the things that we're really keen on doing is looking at this sort of semi-structured effort recording, things like this. What relatively small things can people do which really add value to the data that we get? when we come to the point of analysis. And there are a range of different recommendations, there are a range of different ways in which this can be expressed, and that's something that we're really wanting to take forward in order to make those recommendations. And through many of these, it's that interaction, hopefully through the TSDA partnership, what we're able to do is interact between the needs of agencies and NGOs as well, the volunteers and their interests and their enthusiasms, and the analytical opportunities as well, because there are certain ways in which we can improve or enhance the analysis to make even more use of the data already. So do please use the comments as we're going forward, and in particular in reflection on this particular slide, are there opportunities there that are particularly important to you, that you think would be particularly valuable, that you would encourage us to explore? What are those opportunities? So this is a great opportunity for you to be able to input as well. So moving on, I said about the better use of data. One of the ways in which we can do this is by integrating the data. This is a fairly new way of being able to combine these data sets, but in a sense statistically respect the fact that they've got these different types of structure, different types of coverage, and evenness or unevenness in their coverage as well. So we're going to talk about two case studies. I'll cover pollinators, and then Philip will take over with the birds. So briefly, just to talk about the pollinators, what we did, and this is work done by Francesca Mancini under the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme project, which is funded by DEFRA, but is really appropriate to present here because it's something that we'll be taking forward to bring out some principles in the TSDA combined with Philipp's work on the birds. So we know that there's schemes such as the hoverfly recording scheme, which provide these unstructured data. There isn't a formal way in which we're asking people to collect the data, or they're asking volunteers to collect the data. Many thousands of records from thousands of sites across the country, but they do have these spatial and temporal biases. The sampling effort is, by the nature of the fact that it's ad hoc, well, it's unstructured, the sampling effort is uneven. Just recently, there's been the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. This is very structured. This is designed in a particular way, similar to some of the other TPOP structured schemes. But you can see simply from the map how few sites there are that are covered by this particular scheme. It uses a standardized repeated protocol. And actually the red sites are sites 5 kilometer squares which are shared between those two. So you can see that there's a really big difference in terms of the data availability. But if we go on to the next slide, we're able to see that what Francesca did was she took what looks like, well, what is a reasonably complicated model in order to try and combine these two different data sets, but respecting the fact that they're coming from structured and unstructured data. And in particular, what she did was she said, well, let's see how far we can get with the unstructured data, doing this sort of occupancy modelling that we talked about. And so she did that, and that when you looked at the variance of the parameter, the key parameter estimate, that produces the red histogram shown on the graph. When she integrated the two data sets together and ran the models again, the variance of those same parameter estimates was narrower. The effect may not look huge on that graph, but actually that's a halving in the variance of those parameter estimates. And this, I think, is really remarkable. Although the modelling is quite tricky to do this, and so far it's been done for one species of hoverfly, actually adding really quite a small amount of structured data can double the precision of the occupancy estimates of this much larger data set. So it does suggest that there are many opportunities for being able to do this where we can't, we may not have the volunteer capacity to run a fully structured scheme that answers all of our questions in one go, but what we might be able to do is envisage opportunities where we can run structured sampling at a small set of sites, or maybe combine the unstructured sampling with structured sampling that you're already doing within your agencies or your organizations. So I think this is something that has great potential. But I said there was going to be a second case study, and this is my moment to hand over to Philipp, who will be talking about a case study with birds.
Yeah, so I'd like to use the next few minutes to talk a bit about work we've been doing at the BTO to compare the two main population monitoring schemes that we have for unmarked birds, which is the breeding bird survey, and a scheme called BirdTrack, which encourages members of the public to record their bird sightings whenever and wherever they enjoy birding. And just as a brief recap, the breeding bird survey, which is on the left map here, we currently have about 6,000 sites that are visited every year, which leads to about 10,000 visits during the breeding season. And BirdTrack, on the other hand, in the same season, has about 80,000 visits to about 18,000 sites. So there's almost an order of magnitude more visits in BirdTrack, and so we were trying to figure out if we can make use of these additional data to cover more species and to draw inferences in smaller regions. And while on the surface there's a lot of data in BirdTrack, so it's in the central panel, once you actually look at sites that are revisited, so the point made earlier that these revisits are really what gives us information about trends, the BirdTrack dataset becomes a bit sparser, and you can actually see when you compare the left and right panel that the gaps are relatively similar. So we have fewer observations in areas with low population density, primarily in the uplands. But then interestingly, we also have gaps in BirdTrack in places that perhaps could be considered as boring for recording. And so this particular an issue in areas where there's high intensity agriculture on arable land. And so that's one thing to keep in mind if we think about these unstructured data as gap fillers. So on the next slide, I've also summarized kind of numbers of sites that are visited at different levels of revisit. And in red, you'll see the BBS coverage for each of the countries in the UK. And in blue, the corresponding number of sites with BirdTrack records. And again, you can see that even though if you sum up overall data sets, we have many more BirdTrack records, but once you get to sites that are repeatedly revisited, we're doing in most recent years, we're still doing better than the BBS in terms of locations, but it's not as much a flood of data as it may appear on the surface. And so in the next slide, I'll start getting into the kind of modeling we use. So the concept we have behind this integrated modeling is that, of course, no matter who goes out and how you survey the environment, all the observations stem from the true distribution of the individual birds or any other animal that we're interested in surveying. And the difference between the two schemes is that in the case of the BBS, we tell people where to go and we randomly select the sites that they go to, and that means the sample is representative of the country. We still have imperfect detection. Our surveyors don't see every bird there is, but because they follow a standardized sampling protocol, we know that the effort is the same at every site that is visited. And from this, in this case, distance sampling protocol, we can also estimate the detection probability of individuals. And in BirdTrack, on the other hand, people can go to self-selected sites. So the sites are not necessarily representative of the country. And then we have much less information on how much effort was spent and whether or not people recorded each species equally. But we get, on the other hand, much larger sample sizes, and so we're trying to draw information from that. And on the next slide, I show how that is translated into a statistical model, and you can advance the slide one step further, or a few steps further, actually. So I don't want to go into the technical details, just to show that we try to honor each of those different observation processes in the combined model, and essentially we're directly trying to model the true distribution and abundance of the birds as a kind of population dynamics model, where we estimate survival and recruitment, and then we try to fit these population dynamics to the two types of observations we have: the count from the breeding bird survey and presence and absence, or detection, non-detection, from bird track lists. And I'll show the first case study on the next slide. And for that, we were primarily motivated to, one question we get asked often at the BTO is whether or not we can produce trends for smallish regions. So people are interested in things like catchments, national parks, national character areas. So areas on the order of about 1,000 square kilometers that are much smaller than the sampling strata in the breeding bird survey, and so usually we don't have the statistical power to derive trends from breeding bird survey alone. And in this case, we were looking at corn bunting in the South Downs, and that's an area that is about 1,500 square kilometers, and we currently have about 40 VBS sites there, but that started with about 3 sites in the 90s, so the sample size for most of the past hasn't been large enough to derive a trend. And we currently have almost 400 sites where there are there's at least one bird track list. And so we combined these two data sets in the model that I just showed, and the results are on the next slide. And the first point on the left side that I want to make is, I think a really important aspect of these models is that we take account of the heterogeneity in observer effort. So in the top panel, where the bird is sitting, you see a histogram of how much time was spent on each list. And you see that most lists are around an hour of duration, but some people spend up to 5 hours in this case looking for birds. And in the model, we estimated how that affects the detection probability of birds. And you can see that, like, between doing a list at all, so a few minutes of bird watching, and doing it for 5 hours, you almost triple the detection probability. And that's something really important to take into account. So an absence from a short list should weigh much less than an absence from a long duration list. And on the right side of the slide, you see two result plots, and the joint model fits abundance, but we can also, of course, derive occupancy from that. And so in the top panel, we compare in red the occupancy estimates from the integrated model with occupancy rates estimated on bird track data alone. And you can see the confidence intervals are much smaller from the bird track data alone. We cannot certainly say whether or not there has been a change in the population range. And the same holds true in the lower panel, where we compare abundances from BBS alone with abundances predicted from the integrated model. And again, we gain enormously in precision. I'll contrast this now on the next slide with a second case study where we were looking at a much larger region. So this is the east of England, 3 counties, Norfolk, Suffolk, Essex, where we were interested in whether or not we could improve inferences about colonizing species. So when species colonize or invade, in the beginning, they're usually too rare to be picked up by structured monitoring schemes. And we were interested in seeing whether, by joining the data sets, we can better track what new species are doing and how their populations are evolving. And in this case, we had several thousand bird track locations, and about 200, I think, BBS sites to work with. And I think one important point that you can see from the map in panel B is this gap in boring areas. So if you look into central Essex and central Suffolk, there are very few bird track lists, and that's where we try to leverage the strength from the breeding bird survey, where we have an even spread of sites across the region, regardless of land cover and land use and kind of perceived goodness for birding. And on the next slides, the results are broadly similar to the results in the corn bunting study. So we gain enormously in terms of the precision of the trends, and then we can add, like the more we know about the species ecology, we can add to these models. And in this case, for Cetti's warbler, we know relatively well that the winter conditions influence their survival and productivity, and we can build that into a model and get even more precise trends. And what's reassuring in this case, we actually have a mostly independent validation data set that comes from the rare breeding birds panel, and there's very good agreement between this integrated model and the validation data set. And that leads me to the summary. So on my final slide, I think similar to what Michael was talking about, there are great opportunities in this integrated modeling approach because we can leverage the strength from both structured and unstructured data. And I think the type of model that we've been exploring has particular potential to get better information for regional trends. So between about 1,000 and 10,000 square kilometers, anything beyond something like this East Anglia case study, we hit computational issues, and like we simply don't have the computing power at the time to then get these models to fit. They're not a silver bullet, though. They're quite challenging models to fit. And at the moment, I think there's no one-size-fits-all approach. So we would need custom models for each question that is to be asked. And for some species where we know perhaps more about the biology, we'll do a better job. And the same for areas. So places like Western Northern Ireland, for example, where there are hardly any unstructured bird records, obviously we can't profit from the records that aren't there. I think the other interesting thing that came out of this is that the implications for these opportunistic schemes and how you should design or promote them. And I think it's really, really crucial that we encourage some recording of effort, be it time or area covered. I think it's very important also to encourage absence recording as well as presence recording. And I think that the big challenge for some of the applied work, so a lot of, I think the applied work is interested in, for example, looking at agricultural policy and implications of that. And there the gap is like people don't want to go birding in a big field that's been plowed. And so how do we balance harnessing the enthusiasm of people, but also actually getting data from areas that are critical for policy needs? Yeah, and with those thoughts, I'll return to Niki to wrap up.
Thanks, Philip. So I think a lot of what's been said on this slide, looking at next steps for TSTA, has been covered by others as we've been going along in the presentation. But certainly over the next year, the ways that we want to take this work forward is exploring more opportunities to apply the data integration methods that have been outlined here to real issues that people have. For example, looking at developing more regional trends for selected species, particularly of interest, maybe such that we could group them together so we know more about, for example, the pollinators in a region or decomposers in a region. So thinking about it in a slightly different way, but certainly that's an area that we'd like to get views on what would really be useful to you. We were looking at trying to develop some sort of user guide on the methods for integrating these structured and unstructured data in different situations, because as Philip says, they do require some customization at the moment, but we're looking at whether there are more sort of general principles and things we can share about when these methods could be used. From the kind of development of scheme point of view, as Michael said, we are looking at promoting more re-recording in locations that have been monitored once before with schemes and societies, and that's hopefully something, if it's successful, we can roll out across more and more taxonomic groups over the next few years. And then, as Philipp has just said, encouraging more sort of semi-structured recording and effort recording really adds a lot of value to these data. So we're potentially planning on doing a piece of work looking at the benefits of doing this, and we'll work with schemes in the future to look at how we might be able to do that effectively. So that top question on this slide, I've just changed slides. We're on slide 41 for anyone who's clicking through. The top question has been asked before by Michael, but again, would love to hear your views on that. And then putting out another question here, which is what are the spatial scales most of interest to you in terms of species trends, and what would it be useful to be able to say more about? So are you interested in knowing about more regional trends, or is it specifically site-based trends that you really need more of, which might be more of a challenge, or is it more country-based trends? So we'd love to hear your views on that in the conversation function in Skype. And we've also got another exciting poll, which I'm sure you're all very excited about. Yeah, so which we'll put up now. So while that's on the screen, I would like to open up the conversation function to just general questions that you might have for anybody that has presented here today. And then we'll have a bit of a recap of what views have been expressed in relation to these questions that have been put up throughout. So if you have any comments as we're going along, then please do let us know, and we'll continue to think about them. Thinking back to what do you think is the most critical gap in species coverage and why question that we had further back, we had quite a lot of people saying that upland habitats were a challenge, and those at higher altitudes. So that would involve potentially working more with recorders to try and gather these extra data, which quite a lot of our schemes are looking at doing. For example, we've got a number of schemes such as BBS and butterflies, who are developing sort of upland rovers schemes. So that's where volunteers go and monitor more upland areas. So we are looking at methods for trying to fill these gaps across the schemes. We had another comment on, I'll just say Michael or Rob or Philip, if you want to interject at any point in what I'm saying, then please do. We had a comment about the most critical gap being potentially between birds and fungi, and the difficulties of getting volunteer interest to record these less charismatic species and training up people. I think that's probably quite likely to always be the case to some extent, which is why we are looking at best ways of using the data. Not to say that there isn't other ideas that could be used to try and engage new volunteers. But it's a good point that there is quite a big discrepancy. We have had a comment about the inconsistency of surveys across space and time, leaving a lot of gaps, as well as the use of multiple different methodologies, which make it very difficult, if not impossible, to derive long-term trends and assess the conservation status of a species in a country over different time periods. That is certainly true. I think we should, to some extent, be thankful that we do have quite a lot of data, but I think that is a good point, and that is something that we could investigate further. I don't know if Michael or Rob have any thoughts on that. We've then had a comment about, in terms of vascular plant data, there have been schemes that could be considered structured, such as the Threatened Plants Project, BSPI monitoring schemes, and its partial repeat local change. And we also need to think about how atlas recording is considered. So I think from the point of view of structuring and unstructured and structured data that we're looking at here, those schemes would be, or not schemes, those recording efforts would be considered towards the structured end. I didn't sort of list them in my categorization of structured schemes because they weren't one of the JNCC involved efforts, although BSBI is supported through the schemes and societies listed under the National Schemes and Societies. So we support them via the Biological Records Centre. They are good in that they have that element of structure, so they would be more useful in terms of analysis, and certainly have a lot of value.
Niki, may I come in and just respond to that?
Yes, please do.
Because I think some of those things have addressed or have picked up on a range of different opportunities, and maybe some of the sorts of things which have been at the back of our minds for some time, in that there are many different ways in which data can be called, let's call it semi-structured. And so the atlasing, particularly local atlasing, is one issue. The Threatened Plants projects is another example, and that way of people going out and doing something in a very structured way. I suppose I would look at it from a couple of different perspectives. One is about, clearly there needs to be, those sorts of things need to meet their own specific needs, their sort of proximate needs. And in the case of BSBI, for instance, with Threatened Plants projects, it did. And so that's great. So then the next question is, can we do anything more with those data, given that there's something, those data are then available? And would it, one, create bias within our outputs? And actually, I'm reasonably reassured by some of this initial work that we've done about the different recorder types within the occupancy modelling. I'm reasonably reassured that the bias shouldn't be too bad, if at all. So that's positive, but I think that is worth exploring further. The second thing is can we do something better? Because in that example, you would take all of the data from an atlasing project, or which aimed to get complete coverage, or something which sampled in a very structured way. And then what we can do is, when we want to reuse the data, is we just pare it down to just a set of, it just goes in the unstructured data bucket. And I think this is one of the interesting things of the integrated modelling. Philipp, I suspect, might be concerned about all the issues of statistical complexity and computing power and things like that, which are real, and those will be limitations for now. But where can we use integrated modelling in order to make better use of those data, to respect more the information that's within them because it's structured? And I think that then becomes a really important question. And I think this balance of the two, what can we do with what's available when we pare it down, and is there a problem of using it? And can we make better use of the data? I think this is where there's a lot of opportunity. And that also begins to get to some of these questions about incentives as well, which I noticed a couple of people put in the chat. And I think this then is important. Is it an incentive for somebody going out recording to know that if they record in this way rather than that way, or at this site rather than that site, their records contribute more? And I think that's an open question, and it probably depends on the person, and it probably depends on the day. And I know for me, there'll be some days I'll be happy to go out and, in a sense, serve the community by going to, in quotes, a rubbishy site. giving data, and there'll be other days when, you know what, I just want to go to a wonderful nature reserve and just enjoy it, and I'm happy to send in my records anyway. So I think there's a lot of stuff about the volunteers which are worth exploring further as well there.
I think just to build on that, there are other ways that we try to incentivize our volunteers to participate in our schemes, in terms of things like providing training for them to try and keep them engaged in monitoring a particular taxon, and also things like setting up regional support for volunteers to try and create that kind of community feeling and make them feel like they're supported, I think are quite valuable in terms of retaining interest and stimulating continuity of input. So hopefully that addresses slightly one of the questions that we've had in. If we look at some of the comments that people have contributed on opportunities for the suggested work to filling their evidence needs, we had one comment about combining species data with other types of environmental data, such as gathering specific habitat characteristics and anthropogenic activities that affect that species. We do, in some of our structured schemes, record habitat data and management activities that have occurred where those species are recorded. We are looking over the next year in TSDA whether there is potential for recording more habitat data or recording habitat data in a more consistent way across our schemes. There have been some difficulties with getting volunteers engaged with the concept of recording habitat. So we're looking at different methods to incentivize this sort of additional data, because it could be very useful for things like validating Earth observation as well. And similarly, management activities, if you know that management on a site has changed, then that can also be useful for a variety of ways, including things like validating Earth observation and mapping initiatives rather. We've also had a comment saying a targeted return visit to an old site to see if a given species is still present will clearly have a heavy positive bias, particularly if the original observation was a chance finding. Do you have any comments on that, Michael?
Yeah, just very specifically in terms of the experiment we're going to be running this coming summer, it's not about revisits. It's not on the basis of species, but it's on the basis of the taxonomic group. So it's not the case of going back to a site to see if this unusual carabid is still present, but it's going back to a site where we have had records of carabids once in the past, but not since. And so at that level, I think there is probably less concern about bias. And clearly what we'd also be encouraging is more of that complete list approach to recording. So at least people are going there looking for what, in this case, in this example, what carabids they can see are present or they can sample within that particular site. So I think it's less of a concern than maybe Andy might suggest.
Is there scope to predict occupancy and trends in unsampled areas? And is there information we could prioritise collecting that would enhance our ability to do this?
Not specifically, apart from the fact that it's a good point. I do wonder if integrated modelling could also be an approach, where either done in a very integrated statistical way or in a slightly coarser way, that whether that can be approached to explore some of these relationships between occupancy and abundance, and therefore allow us to get a better handle on changing abundance of species across the country, or a prediction of that, rather than just these completely separate trends of, we have trends of abundance and trends of occupancy. But Rob or Philip might have comments as well.
Okay, we will move on then. There were several comments that have come in about spatial scales of interest. Quite a lot of people saying they'd like to select more than one option on that poll, which is very fair enough. This is a limitation of Skype for Business, which is slightly frustrating. But it's interesting to see what's come out as really high priority, which is more the area and country levels. So potentially investigating the area trends, as we've suggested today, is potentially valuable. And if anybody wants to contact us to think about more specific ideas of what would be of value, then please do get in touch with us, or leave your email address and we'll give you an email at some point after this talk. Well, the same goes to any questions or comments that you might have. Please feel free to carry on getting in touch. There's a comment about one of your slides, Michael, which is your slide in recorder behaviour did not consider vice county recorder and the use of members to record for these semi-structured projects. Oh, and Michael has responded, sorry. This is a very rapid comment sorting process, it turns out.
Yeah, it's just that challenge for those who aren't reading the comments. The challenge between people collecting data in a structured way and that structure being carried through into databases, and so that we can deal with it appropriately, which may be within the statistical analytical design. But yes, that is a challenge where people know that they've collected it in a structured way, but that isn't reflected in the data sets available simply because of maybe some of the limitations of the databases.
Great, thank you. We've had a bit of an advertisement in the comments for the POMS scheme, which is the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme. In POMS, there's integrated very simple habitat categories and flower counts into the 1 kilometre survey protocol. So that links back to, and volunteers seem prepared to collect this information and enter it part of their one-day survey, for which they receive one-to-one training and mentoring. So that links back to points previously about recording supplementary information and incentivising volunteers. And there are some contact details as well for the Pollinator Monitoring Scheme, which I'm sure you can Google as well, or they're in the chat if you want to look at them now. I think we've covered, oh no, we've got one new comment here about it would be great to understand more about the relationship between occupancy and abundance and how that varies predictably. For example, are occupancy trends great for monitoring trends in more fragmented and rare species, but of more limited value for trends in more abundant, widespread species, particularly important for ecosystem processes, etc. There was a lot in that. Michael or Rob, did you have any thoughts on that while I process this question?
If I may chime in quickly, I think it's one of these things where the devil is really in the detail, and where we had a piece of work just out on kind of national level relationships between occupancy and abundance. It's published in Biological Conservation for birds, where we find roughly predictable relationships that there is a positive correlation, but it's really hard to understand where that relationship breaks down, and that's where I think you quickly get into species-specific and scale-specific relationships, and that's, I think, one of the reasons also that kind of picking up Emily's comment, where you really have to look at a particular question, and I think we can very broadly say yes, they're related, but like the deviations from that broad pattern are much harder to predict, and that's where currently in the integrated models we're using, we don't, like we say site colonization and population growth at a site come from the same process, so currently we can't disentangle that in the way we model it, but conceivably one could have a more complex model. But yeah, there's no simple, I think it's one of these things where there is no simple general answer, as much as as we would like one.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Philipp.
Yeah, I saw one question about prediction in unsampled areas.
Oh, great.
And again, so I think, so the scope to predict occupancy and trends in unsampled areas. And so we have one piece of work on distributions rather than trends that is just been accepted by Ali Johnston, my predecessor, where for birds in the UK, we seem to have very good indication that we can quite reliably extrapolate based on land cover classes from sampled to unsampled areas. The big exception there being the uplands again, and it's a bit of a problem in the UK that especially the Scottish Highlands have just very unique environmental conditions, and that's combined with low observation density in those areas. And so the predictions there are much less certain and probably also much less accurate. But for most of the lower lying areas, as long as you're happy to rely on species environment interactions, for birds there's good potential, but again that may vary on taxonomic area.
So one of the really interesting things from that, or important things, is it's very easy to look at a map and go, oh, there's gaps here, there's gaps here, there's gaps here. Whereas actually it's probably better as we go forward to be thinking about the places where we lack information. So exactly as Philipp said, are there particular types of location where we lack a lot of information, which might be based on area, which might be based on habitat, things like this, but to think about it even more critically and thoughtfully than what we've done so far. But I think that's a valuable way of taking things forward.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael and Philipp. I've just had one more comment come through. Saying interesting thoughts about widespread versus localized species in context to some of my current adventures with Hymenoptera, where it's often still unclear for most species whether they're actually widespread or localized. Wonder if we might be able to work towards a mechanism for helping characterize such groups along this spectrum from the patchy data available. No need to answer now, just musing. Anyone else want to muse back on that or answer? No? Okay, no musings. We will muse on it. Great. Well, the frequency of comments coming in is declined, although we have just had another one. Thanking Philipp with a link through to a paper about local population trends being a function of large-scale processes. So I think we will probably draw to a close now, unless there are any other comments. As I've reiterated several times, please do get in touch with any of us about further ideas, or leave your email here and we'll get back to you. I'm going to put up the third of the exciting polls, which is a bit of a feedback poll, which would be great to hear whether you found this webinar useful or interesting, or not, because we will think about doing more similar events to this in the future if it's been useful to you. So please do let us know. I was planning on setting up a mailing list from everybody that's come to this webinar, and I will let you know of any future opportunities. So if you don't want to be on that mailing list, then let me know. I've had a question just coming through about whether the comments from the webinar will be available afterwards. I think what we'll try and do is synthesize them into a sort of summary and circulate that round. So we'll send out something. Thank you very much for being so forthcoming with all your comments. I know it's difficult having a conversation where you can't actually talk out loud with 40 people odd. So unless there's anything else that my colleagues, co-presenters want to add at this point, I think we'll draw it to a close. And thanks very much for coming, everybody.